I'm not going to wait for Wadsworth here to unmask me. I work for the State Department, and I'm a homosexual.
The terms we use for sexual orientation and gender identity have changed a lot in recent years. Clue takes place in 1954, so it's period accurate for Mr. Green to call himself a homosexual. That was the term people used then. But as I explained in another video, by the 90s, terms like gay and lesbian had largely replaced homosexual. So if you were still saying homosexual then, at least in the US, you risked sounding out of touch or uncomfortable with gay people.
Homeroom teacher? Homosexual.
At the same time, there was growing awareness that talk of gay rights and gay issues, even in a gender-neutral sense, had often overlooked people who were bisexual or transgender. And so there was a push to use more inclusive acronyms like GLBT or LGBT. And today, the most commonly used version of that acronym is LGBTQ, where the Q stands for queer. And man, oh man, if you could see some of the comments I get about this word. Some people are confused by it and don't understand what it's supposed to mean or why it's in the acronym. Others understand it, but hate it so much that they don't think it should be part of the acronym, and they absolutely don't want it applied to them. And still others love it so much that they don't understand why we don't just get rid of the awkward acronym and just use queer all the time as an all-inclusive term. So why the big divide on the word queer? Actually, there's a good chance you think you already know why. And if so, you're probably wrong. In a scene from the film All of Us Strangers, two gay men from different generations have a short conversation about the use of the term queer. The older of the two confesses that he's not comfortable with the word, partly because of the trauma he still feels from hearing it as an insult when he was younger. The younger character says that's why he doesn't like the word gay, because it was used as an insult in his youth. And this is how this discussion is often framed, at least for gay men, that queer was the insult of a previous generation, but it's been reclaimed, while gay was a more recent insult, so that baby boomers and Gen Xers prefer gay, while millennials and Gen Zers prefer queer. And okay, there is some truth in this. There is a generational divide here, and for some people, a word's past use as an insult can permanently alter how they feel about it. But that is not even close to the whole story. There's plenty of disagreement on this within generations, there's way more to this history than insults, and this isn't just about gay men. But before we dive into why the word queer is so popular and so controversial, I want to ask a favor of you. I know that some of you have very strong feelings about this. I have heard from lots of folks on all sides. And in this video, I am going to do my very best to explain to everyone why someone might feel the way you do. But will you join me in trying to put yourself in the other side's shoes as well to understand why they feel the way they do, why they hate the word even if you love it, or why they love it even if you hate it? I'm not asking you to agree with them, but can we try to have empathy for each other instead of just arguing for our own views? Are we agreed? Yes? I'm going to assume yes. Okay, so let's dig into some history.
Is there something queer going on, sir?
Yes, my child, something queer is going on.
For centuries, since the 1500s in fact, the word queer has traditionally meant odd, weird, or strange, very often with a negative connotation, like something's not quite right.
That strikes me mighty queer.
You looked ill. Queer.
How queer everything is today.
In fact, as recently as the 1990s, there was a children's mystery book series with titles like Something Queer is Going On, meaning essentially something weird is happening, something feels off. So when queer was used to describe gay men as far back as 1894, it was in that sense. It was an insulting way to talk about men who were attracted to other men, calling them weirdos, saying something wasn't quite right about them. They were queer. And this use of queer, as a slur typically against gay men, continued throughout the 20th century. And though I've compared it to the rather silly word weirdo, queer was actually considered far more offensive. In a 1970 survey of gay men, queer was considered the most offensive of all the slurs they had to endure, more offensive than the F slur. According to the respondents, while some slurs, including that F slur, might be reclaimed and used playfully within the community, queer was too offensive for that. It was the word straight people used to express disgust. And queer didn't just convey disgust, it often carried an implied threat of violence. For decades, one of the most popular playground games for American kids was called Smear the Queer, a rough game with many variations that all had one thing in common. Everyone was supposed to gang up against the one person labeled the queer. As one writer described it in 1983, you tackled him, you crunched him, you drove him into the grass, pounded him into the ground, leaving little more than a smear. That was the name of the game. So whether you interpreted that word queer to mean gay or just odd, it was clear to generations of kids that queer was one thing you didn't want to be, because that was the person who was going to be attacked. That was the person who was going to be smeared. And many closeted gay boys took that lesson into adulthood, where Smear the Queer wasn't just a game. So it's understandable, given that history, that the transition from queer to gay had such deep emotional weight for a lot of people. It was turning from a word of fear, trauma, and violence, a word that meant that you were the other, to a word of self-acceptance.
It's an embarrassment. It's nothing more, it's nothing less. Why be scared of that? Scared of being called queer? Are you? Maybe. Maybe not. And are you? Queer. Gay.
Gay was a word the community had chosen for itself. It was a word that meant happy, not weird. So it's no wonder that the people who fought for decades to not be called queer anymore would be upset to have people today so casually call them queer again. Many tell me it feels like a slap in the face every time, because whether it's being used as a slur or not, it's a word with a history of trauma for them, the one word they most didn't want to be called, and it's being used once again to identify them against their will, most often by people who didn't have to go through what they went through. Totally understandable. But here's where it gets more complicated, because not everyone who went through that hates the word queer. Some were part of the group that helped reclaim it, and others hate the word today for a different reason, even though they didn't go through that. So if you're a straight person who feels like you're getting mixed messages about the word queer, you probably are. Because it turns out LGBT plus people have been divided on this word since the 90s. And that famous reclaiming you've heard about? Well, it was a lot more divisive than you might think.
Dorothy, I never understood why your brother liked to wear women's clothes, unless he was queer.
Sophia, people don't say queer anymore, they say gay.
They say gay if a guy can sing the entire score of Gigi. But a 6'3", 200-pound married man with kids who likes to dress up like Dorothy Lamour, I think you have to go with queer.
In 1990, queer was on its way out, at least in polite society. But notice something about this joke. When Sophia calls Phil queer, she doesn't mean what we might mean today. Today, a straight man who wears dresses might actually use the term queer for himself, as an umbrella term that includes gender expression. But in 1990, queer was still either a slur against gay people or a word for weird. So when Sophia calls Phil queer, what she's actually saying is that he's weird for wearing dresses. In other words, he may not be gay, but he's definitely not normal. And in the 80s and 90s, many LGBT plus people were desperately fighting to change that, to finally be seen as normal. That's part of why queer was so offensive to so many people. Queer meant abnormal. And yet, newsflash, minority groups aren't monolithic. They don't always agree on everything. Not everyone wanted to be seen as normal. So in 1990, the same year the Golden Girls were teaching Americans to stop saying queer, a group called Queer Nation showed up at the New York City Pride March with pamphlets titled, "Queers? Read this." For some, queer means strange, they wrote. That's okay, we like that. But some gay girls and boys don't. They think they're more normal than strange. But when a lot of lesbians and gay men wake up in the morning, we feel angry and disgusted, not gay. So we've chosen to call ourselves queer. Using queer is a way of reminding us how we are perceived by the rest of the world. It's mostly because of Queer Nation that people today talk about queer having been reclaimed. But at the time, Queer Nation actually wasn't trying to make queer less controversial or reclaim it as a term for everyone. They were leaning into the controversy to draw a line between the gays, who wanted to fit into mainstream society, and the queers, who didn't.
That is so true. I was watching these two guys on Nightline on Gay Pride Day, and one of them said, "Hi, I'm Bob Wheeler, and I'm an attorney, and my lover, he's a surgeon, and we would like to show America that all gays are not limp-wristed, screaming queens. There are gay truck drivers and gay cops and gay lumberjacks," and I just thought, ooh, get her.
Yes, that is Patrick Stewart in a fairly obscure gay film from the 90s, playing a member of Queer Nation, or rather a member of the Queer Nation-affiliated Pink Panther Patrol, which was a real thing. And it's supposed to be a funny scene, but this was actually a really big disagreement among gay people at the time. Do we want to integrate into mainstream society or not? And it's a common debate for all sorts of minority groups and civil rights movements. In fact, if you've ever seen any X-Men media, you're familiar with this dynamic already. If you're not already familiar, Marvel's X-Men stories are about two groups of superpowered mutants led by two charismatic leaders who both want to end society's oppression of mutants, but strongly disagree on how to do that. Professor X represents the integrationist view. He wants mutants to be seen as normal, just like humans, but with different gifts. He wants them to be able to integrate into mainstream human society. Magneto, on the other hand, represents the separatist view. He argues, we're not like humans. Humans are the enemy. They're never going to willingly give us our rights, so we have to build our power and take them by force, not to fit into their society, but to build our own. And this was more or less the argument Queer Nation was making. Straight people are your enemy, they wrote. If gays wanted equality, they said, straights must be frightened into it, terrorized into it. Fear is the most powerful motivator. Other sections of their pamphlet have the bold words, "I hate straights," and also proclaimed hatred for the Pope, the Catholic Church, and all sorts of mainstream American institutions. For Queer Nation, being queer rather than gay meant rejecting straight society. As a member told the Boston Globe in 1991, the word queer, quote, tells people that we're opposed to assimilating. Those who believe that they're just like anyone else aren't queer. They're gay. Queer people, they said, don't want to fit into the straight world like gays do. We just want to make our own safe space. So when Queer Nation marched with their now famous chant, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it," they were essentially saying, you think we're strange? You think we're not like you? You're right, and there's nothing you can do about it because we're not going anywhere. It was a chant of anger and defiance. But you might wonder, why was Queer Nation so angry? Not only at straight people, but also at gay integrationists who wanted to be seen as normal. Well, you have to remember what they'd just been through.
A mystery disease known as the gay plague has become an epidemic unprecedented in the history of American medicine.
Today, we know it as AIDS. But in the early 80s, it was briefly known as GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency disease. And I know some of you are thinking, what does this have to do with the word queer? But I promise, I'm going somewhere with this. Stick with me. Many early AIDS cases were among sexually active gay men, and that unleashed a new wave of fear and disgust toward gay men from people who were scared of catching whatever this new thing was. So mainstream society largely kept its distance as an entire generation of LGBT plus young people watched their friends get sick and die. Often young men whose own families wouldn't hug them on their deathbeds or even come to their funerals. And suddenly, this debate was a matter of life and death. How do we make society care and take this seriously? Show that we're likable or show that we're powerful? Queer Nation didn't exist yet, but Queer Nation's founders had started out in another separatist group called ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which tried to make society pay attention through shows of power, using disruption and confrontation. In one famous case, they disrupted a Catholic mass, and a protester took the consecrated Eucharist wafer from the priest, something very sacred to Catholics, and crumbled it and threw it on the ground. This horrified integrationists, who saw these tactics as hurting the cause, giving straight society a reason to see gay people as the enemy. On the other hand, the integrationist desire to fit in and be non-threatening angered separatists, who saw it as giving up their power and letting more people die. Just like in X-Men, these two groups were working against each other. While Professor X is fighting to convince humans not to be afraid of mutants, Magneto is fighting for the opposite. He wants humans to be afraid. For him, that fear is power. And that was essentially Act Up's approach: gain power by being feared rather than liked. And in 1990, 4 Act Up members founded Queer Nation to take that approach to issues beyond just AIDS. So, from the beginning, Queer Nation was hugely controversial, not only for their polarizing language, but also for their confrontational tactics, which sometimes included forcibly outing people. And as Queer Nation chapters opened across the US, their use of the word queer became a major point of debate among LGBT activists. Soon, whether you called yourself queer was widely seen as a symbol for whether you agreed more with Queer Nation or with the more Professor X-style integrationist groups. Calling yourself queer meant that you were an assertive or militant homosexual, as opposed to gay, which meant that you were an assimilationist or integrationist homosexual. As the New York Times put it, the word had created a rift in the gay community, exposing deep divisions between lesbian and gay militants and moderates. So it's no wonder a lot of straight people were confused, and in a lot of ways we still see the ripples of that Queer Nation debate today. Among people I've talked to across generational lines, those who see themselves as boundary pushers are somewhat more likely to use the word queer, and those who see themselves as mainstream are somewhat less likely to use it. But you may be sitting here thinking, wait, what about the bi and trans folks? What about the umbrella? Good question, you. And if you weren't thinking it, you should have been, because as I said at the beginning, this isn't just about gay men, and it's not just about gay men and lesbians either. So what about that umbrella? When I ask people today what they like about the word queer, most of them don't talk about politics or activism or Queer Nation. In fact, many of them weren't even alive when these things happened. Most of them talk about inclusion. Queer today is often used as an all-inclusive term, an umbrella to cover lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender people, and others. But in the early days of reclaiming queer, mainstream society wasn't much talking about some of these groups. Bisexual and transgender folks were still fighting for visibility in what was widely thought of as the gay community, or the gay and lesbian community. So at first, Queer Nation just used queer to describe lesbians and gay men. But that quickly changed. Bi and trans advocates, who had been there all along of course, were pushing to be seen and recognized. And it was clear to many that sticking together, despite their differences, had a lot of advantages. Many lesbians had demonstrated this powerfully by caring for their gay brothers during the AIDS epidemic. So a lot of mainstream gay groups became LGBT groups. But people who were saying queer took a different approach. They were already embracing the idea that queer meant odd, so why not just expand it to include all the oddballs, everyone outside the mainstream? And by the mid-90s, some academic scholars had picked up that sense of queer and started using the word to describe new, boundary-pushing ideas about sexuality and gender. Soon, universities were offering courses in queer studies and queer theory, where queer could mean any kind of challenging of established norms. And again, there was debate about this. Some saw this new meaning of queer as freeing, a chance to color outside the lines of traditional assumptions about sex and gender, while others objected to the idea that being LGBT should be equated with pushing boundaries at all. As one gay writer argued, humans are different in all sorts of ways. We wouldn't set apart people with red hair as challenging the norms set by people with brown or black hair. We simply acknowledge that humanity includes many different kinds of hair, some more common than others, but all equally normal. But the majority of straight people didn't even know this debate was going on at the time. Most of mainstream society still considered queer a slur. But several things helped push queer back into everyday usage, including a 1999 British TV show about 3 gay men. The show was called Queer as Folk, as a play on words, a reference to the Old English expression, "there's nowt so queer as folk," meaning there's nothing as weird as people. But when an American remake used the same title a year later, most Americans didn't have the context to realize it was a pun. It just felt like, oh, I guess queer is the word we're using now. Then in 2003, the Bravo network followed that lead and titled their new show Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, which again caused controversy at the time, but it wasn't nearly the huge deal it would have been, say, 10 years earlier. But probably the biggest factor in bringing back queer was the internet, which had created a platform for the first time in history for millions of people to frankly and anonymously discuss whatever they wanted, including their individual experience with sexuality and gender. Young people especially began coining new terms and deconstructing old ones, and the resulting explosion in new identity labels made the LGBT acronym feel woefully inadequate to many people. For a lot of people who didn't identify as L, G, B, or T, the less rigidly defined term queer felt a lot more welcoming. And for people who came of age in the era of Queer as Folk, Queer Eye, queer studies, queer theory, and a vast online community of self-described queer thinkers and bloggers and influencers, the word queer wasn't tied to past trauma or violence or to militant political movements. It didn't mean weirdo or even necessarily boundary pusher. It might have a slight edge of subversion, but mostly it was a fresh new umbrella term, something more inclusive than the acronym that could instantly accommodate new and ever-changing identity labels. It was a term that connected you to the LGBT+ rights movement of the past, but also allowed you to be part of a community in the present, even if none of the other labels felt quite right. And it also proved useful for those who were still finding themselves. It meant you could acknowledge your differences without putting yourself in too much of a box. If you knew you weren't like most people, you could declare yourself queer without having to specify if you were gay or bi, if you were trans or just gender non-conforming, or maybe non-binary, maybe more than one of those, or some other term that hadn't even been invented yet. You could blur the lines, you could be on a journey toward figuring yourself out, and you didn't have to know yet where that journey was going to end up. You could just say, I'm queer. And you could add other labels too, when you wanted, if you wanted, but you didn't have to. And this is a common theme I've heard from people who love queer, that not only is it a simple and inclusive way to describe the broader community of sexual and gender minorities, but also, for some people, that it's the term they feel fits them best as individuals. More than a few people have told me that when no other label felt quite right, discovering queer finally gave them hope and made them feel like they had a place to belong too. And that puts us in a tough position. Because if the same word that makes some people feel included and hopeful makes others feel ostracized and even re-traumatized, how do we choose? Do we use it or not? Reclaimed slurs like queer are almost always controversial. While some find it empowering to take back a word from their oppressors, others find it demeaning or hurtful, no matter who's using the word. And that's why reclaimed slurs usually never gain widespread acceptance. When gay men reclaimed the F-slur, it was really only okay to say it if you were one, and even plenty of people who were one still found it offensive. To this day, it's controversial enough that I don't even want to say it in this video. And I'm sure you can think of other reclaimed slurs like this. I am not going to name them. But queer's evolution into a broader umbrella term gave it advantages that most reclaimed slurs don't have. I mean, there's no real reason to use the F-slur today because gay means the same thing and is less offensive. But there's no other word that has quite the same meaning as the modern use of queer. Even an acronym like LGBT doesn't include all the terms that could fall under that broad queer umbrella. We could put a plus on the end of the acronym for those other terms, and people often do, but that sort of ends up feeling like the original theme song of Gilligan's Island, which named almost all the characters and then said, and the rest. Nobody wants to be and the rest, and being relegated to a plus can kind of give that vibe. Saying queer, theoretically at least, puts everyone on the same level. But queer also has some pretty big disadvantages. Not only its history as a slur, a radical political term, and an othering word, but even its use as an umbrella term is problematic for some people. And that's part of a larger cultural conversation right now. A similar umbrella term, people of color, has also recently been criticized for mashing together very different racial and ethnic groups based essentially on just not being white. Critics argue that that subtly suggests that white people are the standard and everyone else is defined by their deviation from that norm, ignoring all their other differences. And similar arguments have been made about queer, that it makes straight cisgender people the norm and describes everyone else as the other, defined not by who they are, but by who they're not. And even among those who embrace queer as a broad umbrella, there's sometimes disagreement about how broad it should be. Are there limits around who can be called queer? If even some straight cisgender people now call themselves queer, does that cause the word to lose meaning? And worse, what about people engaging in harmful, immoral, or predatory behavior? Is all boundary pushing queer? And if not, who decides what is? The broadness of queer is its greatest strength as well as its greatest weakness, and it's a word that continues to evolve. But in the end, I think the debate today mostly comes down to two groups of people who've had very different, emotionally resonant experiences. For some, queer has been a traumatizing and othering word. And for others, queer has been a powerfully inclusive and life-giving word, not just as an abstract umbrella, but as a personal identity that makes them feel seen. And because these two groups often have significant demographic differences, the debate about queer can quickly turn into a debate about ageism, or who's included, or who's experienced the most hardship. See, the queer thing about queer is that it somehow unites people and divides them at the same time. And I honestly often feel right in the middle of it. I'm a gay man who's old enough to remember when queer was a violent slur, and although I personally don't have any trauma that I know of around the word, I have many friends who do. I've seen how this word wounds them deeply, and I don't think it's fair to just wave away their trauma, or to tell them that because it's not traumatizing to me, it shouldn't be traumatizing to them. That's not how trauma works. And by the way, I'm also young enough to remember the days of school kids saying, "That's so gay" as an insult. And while, yeah, that was painful too, in my view, the two really aren't equivalent at all. For a whole bunch of reasons, that's a topic for another time if anyone's interested. But I also have so many friends who love and cherish the word queer, many of whom say it's the word that fits them best. And just as I can't wave away someone else's trauma, I can't take away someone else's identity word, especially when I'm blessed enough to have other terms that fit me well. You know, ultimately, I believe it's important to use the labels people prefer for themselves whenever we can. So if someone tells me that they do or don't identify as queer, I want to honor that choice. But what if we want to talk about a whole group of people who don't all identify the same way? The best solution I've found for the current moment is to use the acronym LGBTQ. It's widely used and broadly understood, and if you prefer the term queer, you're clearly included. But LGBT folks who don't identify as queer are also explicitly included without being forced to take on a label that they may find hurtful or traumatizing. Of course, it's not a perfect solution. Some people may not identify with any of these letters, and you could argue that queer is still taking on that "and the rest" role for those folks, which isn't ideal. It's also awkward and a bit cumbersome to say, although, maybe that's appropriate for a hodgepodge group of folks who don't always have all that much in common with each other. In the future, maybe we'll have different, better language. Or maybe queer will stick around, and generations from now there will be no one left alive who associates it with trauma or who experiences it as an othering word. But given the wide range of ages of the people I've heard from on both sides, I don't think that's happening anytime soon. So for now, this is the best compromise I've got. And if you disagree, I just hope we can keep showing empathy to each other and trusting each other's good intentions. Because in the end, what matters more than our words is what our words symbolize, our stories, our personal experiences, and the compassion and empathy we can show to others who've been through different things that affected them profoundly. That's why we care so much about labels. They tell a piece of our stories. And our stories are all different, but every one of them matters.